Well, hello everybody. Welcome to Solutions with Shanti, and a beautiful new book club today, Mountain Sing. Looking forward to that. So, welcome everybody, and thank you for those who've joined us. And Jessie, straight over to you.
All right. Well, good morning. We're going to be starting. I guess I got my screensaver on here. We'll be starting Mountain Singing. You can't really see it too well, but see if I can do it. There we go, by uh, Santa Morrison Barlow. And I just want to talk just a little bit about this book, not so much about what it's all about, but um, it's a story of the gospel recordings that first went out into the Philippine areas. And so this was put out by the Moody Bible Institute in Chicago in 1952 and dedicated to the waiting tribes who cannot speak for themselves. And, that line there really is so much to this book that, in my journey of life and learning how to, um, really live by faith. This is one of the books that the Lord had me read that just immensely encouraged me because, so many of us, so many times feel so silenced. We feel like we don't know how to grow our faith. We want a deeper faith. We want it ever deepening, but we don't know how to get there. We don't know how to relate with God. There's moments we feel like we don't know how to relate to other believers. Um, and certainly then you've got the challenge of how do we relate to people that, have completely different faiths than ours, or maybe they don't even have faith at all. Maybe they're, all that we see of these people is their need, that they're desperate, they're destitute, they're going through trials and tribulations, and we want to help, but we don't know how. We don't know how to start. So this book is really great for that because we see these women in that position where, they have that desire to grow their faith, yet at the same time share it. And, they had to really lean on the Holy Spirit to be creative. How do you connect with others in a way that, not beating them over the head with the Bible, like a lot of uh, churches teach us, how do you share the experience of God in a way that draws others to God? And so we shall start with the foreword here. It says gospel recordings is a synonym for gospel miracles. A young missionary, too ill to return to her field in Latin America, had a call from God to send out some gospel records in Spanish. So they would literally make records that, could go on record players that they would take out. Um, these records might be used in places where missionaries could not go or could not stay. Now these gospel records are pouring out at a rate that will soon reach 500,000, and they are going out now in 400 languages. And that was back in the 1960s. George Mueller said that one purpose of establishing his orphanages was to show the Christian world that God is a living God and does hear and answer prayer. Gospel recordings has had an unbroken pathway of the supernatural working of God to answer to prayer, which has stimulated the faith of thousands as well as reaching hundreds of thousands who are hearing the gospel for the first time through these records. My stay of several weeks in the headquarters of Gospel Recordings gave me a glimpse of prayer and faith and New Testament living and victorious fellowship that I have not seen in other places. There are now 31 full-time workers who from the beginning have served without any salary or any allowance, and have trusted the Lord for their board as well as all their other expenses. The story of what God has done through Joy Ritteroff and Anne Sherwood in Latin America, in Alaska, and in the Philippines is breathtaking. They have gone through experiences that hardy pioneers might shrink from. But this all has been so simple, just day by day trusting the Lord for little miracles and great miracles. This book records but a part written by one of the staff called of the Lord in a special way to this work and war of faith. Gospel recordings is a synonym also for gospel rejoicing. Many Christian groups preach victory. In the gospel recording headquarters, they literally obey the command, rejoice always, pray without ceasing, in everything give thanks. With them, everything means just that. Dr. Wilbur M. Smith, in speaking of his book, said, "This group is doing one of the best pieces of Christian work in the Western world today. Of that, there is no doubt. Every Christian leader who has been in touch with this work has borne the same testimony. Gospel recordings is one of the new methods that God is using in the final great push to complete the Great Commission and get the gospel message to every tribe and tongue on earth." And that was foreword was written by Dr. Robert C. McQuilkin, who is the president of Columbia Bible College in South Carolina. So the preface, this is by Joy Ritteroff, who's one of the main, she's the director of gospel recordings. She's one of the main characters in this story. On the eve of our departure for the Philippines, a lady whose name I do not remember came up to me and said, "I want to give you this verse. Isaiah 55:12. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you in singing." Here was a message from God to us, a reminder that there would be mountains, high, impassable, treacherous, but that these very mountains would be turned by Him in each case to a thrilling outcome of victory and gladness. The story of it is contained in this volume, so aptly planned and written by Sana Barlow, a member of our staff. I feel deeply indebted to her for her tireless efforts expanded in the production of this work. The fact that she is in the family and was in such close touch with us through correspondence while these experiences were happening prepared her to understand and feel, as well as picture the adventures of our 14 months trip to these islands and the archipelago. Not even sure I said that word correct. The islands of the archipelago or pelago. The purpose of the book is to give the reader a glimpse of gospel recordings abroad. It is an inside view of things just as they are. In doing this, she has told you our procedure for reaching remote tribes and how we actually get records made in unwritten languages. As the manuscript goes to press, a team consisting of the author Anne Sherwood, Vaughn Collins, and myself are embarking for Indonesia and many other places in the Far East. The account as told in these pages is a potent reminder to us of God's integrity and care and of His miracle power, which answers to faith and rejoicing. Again, the mountains will reverberate with joyous praise as many tongues and tribes hidden away within them shall hear at last the good news of eternal life. Perhaps as a result of this writing, many will feel in the unique way the responsibility of praying for us in this and all future undertakings of Gospel Recordings Incorporated. If so, we will consider that it has been vastly worthwhile, and what a reward it will be to realize that through the means of these little preaching plates, tribes to whom He was not spoken of shall see, and multitudes who have not heard shall understand. And then we have a note to the reader. This book is written in first person because it is an assimilation of Joy Ritteroff's own story, molded into chapters by the author who has chosen to present it, not holding the reader at arm's length by a third-person narrative, but rather drawing the reader into living the experience as Joy tells it. For it is, in fact, her own story, and yet it is more than a story. It is a habit of walking out where God is always smiling, even though clouds and mountains of impossibility are breaking forth into singing. All right. So in my book, we're on page 15, if people are following along. She quotes Isaiah, a couple verses out of Isaiah 49:13. Sing, O heavens, and be joyful, O earth, and break forth into singing, O mountains, for the Lord has comforted his people and will have mercy upon his afflicted. Isaiah 55:12. For you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you into singing, and all the trees of the field shall clap their hands. Isaiah 44:23. Sing, O you heavens, for the Lord hath done it. Shout, you lower parts of the earth, break forth into singing, you mountains. So here we go, the Philippine Islands. And at the time that they were going, in 1947, when they started, the majority of the Philippine Islands was all pagan areas. There were very few areas where they had Protestant or Roman Catholic Christian churches in that area. So they kind of have the island broken into, it looks like four main areas. You have Luzon, you have Mindoro, Palawan, and Mindanao are the four main areas. So Luzon is kind of up in the north. You got Mindoro that's kind of right below it. You have Palawan a little bit to the side, and then in the south you have Mindanao. So chapter 1, to the Philippines. The Philippine Islands are mostly mountain ranges standing out of the sea. Joy, how did you happen to go to the Philippines? The question has often been asked before and since our 14-month recording trip to the islands. How did you choose this place from among all the countries in the world? To such questions, implying some dramatic reason, I must always simply answer, no, it was just an incident which caused me to stumble upon certain facts about the mountain Philippines and the tribes pocketed away in their vastness. It made it imperative for us to go. I shall never forget the day that first personally introduced us to the Philippines. It was June of 1947. The Copper River Indian Valley in Alaska was green carpeted and covered with brilliant wildflowers and bathed in sunshine. Only the gigantic snow-covered mountain flanking the north of the valley reminded Anne Sherwood and me that we were in the Arctic Circle. The new Pontiac that had been provided for us only 4 days before leaving our Los Angeles was parked in the sloping yard near the tiny log cabin built for the young missionaries who had just arrived from the States to begin work among the Alaskan Indians in this valley. I just want to quick say, I actually had at Bethel Seminary out of Minneapolis, one of my professors, and I can't remember his name, but he was one of the individuals who went into that upper Alaska area as well in the early 1940s, and was one of the individuals who helped them form their language, which was all verbal, into a written language. Um, so, this kind of aligns with some of those things that, all these undeveloped areas. The Clarks were busily storing in supplies of wood and meat against the ice age that was winter in their North Country, where the temperatures could drop 90 degrees below zero. I just can't even imagine that. Such a thing seemed incredible to us. Although at night, when we crawled into our mummy bags in the upper and lower berths of our sleeper, front and back seats of our car, we could feel ice and snow in the breeze that fanned the valley and frosted the window panes. The Clark's log cabin was built small and compact in order to make it snug and warm, and Anne and I were accustomed to our paddock sleeper by now, having traveled to Alaska along the lowly stretches of the new and dangerous Alcan Highway, the Alaskan Highway. We were engrossed now with the most thrilling field recording venture yet in the history of our 8-year-old work with Gospel Recordings Incorporated. But one night, as I snuggled down into my sleeping bag, the thoughts were there, tugging at my consciousness like the little boats that pull a ship from harbor out to sea again. I tried to resist ideas of another trip. This one had just begun, but we had let ourselves down heavily upon God, knowing that the supply of each day's need, as well as our finding in scattered villages, walled from each other by their individual languages, would be 5 months' venture worthy of priorities in prayer, in time, and energy. Yet from the first night the little boats began to tug, there were never a give up until we had launched out towards the 2-year distant mountain archipelago. Young Clark had been helping us to map out our recording plans for work along with his Indians, and in the midst of our discussion, he had said to me, "You know, Miss Rudderoff, there are scores of different languages in the Philippine Islands. While I was there as a soldier, I saw the condition of the native tribes living back in the hills, and the majority of them have nothing of the gospel in their own dialects. And from that moment, the island mountains, released from the embargoes of war, loomed upon the horizon of the future, nearing gradually until we finally set foot upon them in November of 1949. Yet even in the wartime Philippines, trails were being hewn out for us from many directions, and the ones preparing those roads for our recording missions did not know they were doing it. Most of them had never heard the work of the gospel recordings, nor of Joy Rudderoff. But God, seeing the day it is yesterday in California, or tomorrow in the Orient, and seeing the first beginnings of roads destined to cross each other for mutual benefit, God had begun our Philippine itinerary even before 1939, with our first small package of records in Spanish being mailed out to Honduras. At that time, I had never dreamed that God would take a song of rejoicing from the heart of one sick missionary and begin to do a decade of miracles which have never ceased to thrill me, and one by one, who have joined me in these years to become the colony of us at home in our missionary compound in the heart of Los Angeles. We never cease to marvel at the wonder of God in our midst, adequately financing us, being himself alone the one who hears of our needs, and carrying us more swiftly from opportunity to opportunity than our own imaginations could possibly take us. All this from the first months when income and expenditures could be computed on the back of an envelope with an expected total of $15 to the present, when 1 month's shipping amounts to sending out tens of thousands of free records around the world as ordered from our stock in 400 languages. But from the time of the laying of the cornerstone of this new mission for missions, we had been little more than spectators, watching as the building took shape, made with other hands than ours. Indeed, to the architect alone could go the praise, and to us only the increasing conviction that he is, not in religious phrasing and harmony, but in the everyday demands that have no other recourse than to persist in finding out God. Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I will do a new thing on the earth, and suddenly it shall spring forth, and I will work, and who shall hinder it? The following story of singing in the night was unknown to us upon our setting forth in the Philippines, but it illustrates one of the paths carved out by the engineer who destined field recordings for the islands. Chapter 2, Singing in the Night. So sing in the darkest night, every day, all the way, sing, sing, sing. It was in 1942. Morning rising up out of the Sulu Sea was veiled and subdued by heavy clouds. The long shadows covered the deep crevices of the mountain ranges of the west. The sea and the beaches were gray upon Brooks Point, and the backbone ridges of Palawan stood black against the lowering sky. Night would not release its hold upon the Philippines for yet 3 more years, and it was the darkest night in history, for 500 sea miles away the enemy had won the battle of Corregidor. A little group of fugitives stood in the shadows of Macagua Gorge and looked far below them out beyond the jungle hills and the groves of alchemical palms and coconuts to where they could see the wide, unsheltered beaches at the point. Through survey instruments, they looked towards the village that had been home a few months ago. Mr. T. H. Edwards gazed earnestly upon his adapted homeland in the Philippines and thought of the crates of alchemical gum stacked and ready for shipping and left upon the shore where not every fishing boat were anchored now, but where these refs were out to sea coming in now. He adjusted his survey lens. They were rafts, but not fishing rafts, and a familiar fear struck consciously once more. Almost a year of refugeeing was taking its toll upon Edwards and his fine Filipino wife and family. Even at this moment, he felt much concern for his son Albert, who lay in the midst desperately ill with a third bout of black water fever. They, like the Sutherlands, had found the jungle full of malaria but empty of food, yet they dared not return home, for since the time of the Japanese invasion they had fled, knowing full well what would happen should they fall into the hands of the enemy. This morning, however, the Edwards had been cheered by the early arrival of the brave Scottish family who had joined them for another Sunday morning service of encouragement and praise. Yet for the Sutherlands, and for the Edwards too, this was but the beginning of the long night which covered the entire Philippines in one great sorrow, where the pathway of faith for some was to lead under the sharp edge of the sword and into the gates of day, and for others the pathway of a like precious faith would lead eventually to deliverance from the edge of the sword unto further service upon the earth. But the hours of the night were to be carved out by suffering, yet there would also a song low under the body of pain, lifting the spirit with winds over the dark mountains. Harry Edwards' face paled as his eyes strained to catch the scene developing on the beaches at Brooks Point. At first he said nothing. Then with certainty he gave an alarm in low, guarded tones. "The Japs are landing upon the beaches at Brooks Point." Instantly Sutherland's survey glasses were verifying the startling news. A hush fell heavily upon the little group gathered behind the protecting foliage of Macagua. How much time would it take to escape the inevitable search for them that would follow this invasion? He knew that a paper had been placed over the door of his home stating that he and his family were marked out for death. Sandy Sutherland, bareheaded, wearing a khaki shirt and shorts and canvas shoes, stood beside the taller American, Harry Edwards, and silently watched the enemy invade the home base of his missionary endeavor. How well Sutherland knew the terrain of the country of Palawan, laying obliquely in the northeasterly and southwesternly directions. He had loved discovering it for himself, traveling north and south along the beaches and east and west through the mountains. He had crossed Palawan on one of the very few trails where it was northwest at the place of Abo Abo River. Having to run on account of the rain and the treacherous Alamatuk leeches, he had covered the entire breadth of the island in 3 or 4 hours, and at other times on different trails through the mountains, he had taken 2 or 3 days traveling to reach the other side. Trekking interior and the tireless missionary had found that having once cleared the narrow coastal plains of nearest jungles, he would come to the rainforest where pagan Palawanos needed the gospel. Sometimes along the trail, there would be a little village of 60 people in every hour or so of hiking, and at other times there would be 2 days of trekking many miles through territory where nobody lived. The Japs were clearing the beaches, and even as Edwards and Sutherland watched them, they were getting well ensconced in the village of Brooks Point. The Sutherlands painfully imagined the present occupants of their ain home, which was built to face the shore looking towards Benio. Its back windows framed the westward peaks, rising 7,000 feet and crowding the interior all the way to the coast on the other side, where the rock-ribbed shoreline and mountains dropped sheer into the sea. These were the forested mountains and the farthest Palawano tribesmen who yet await their first hearing of the gospel. Sandy Sutherland's missionary heart burned with zeal to somehow reach these remotest villages of the pagans. His zealous campaign in this vision was the son of Harry Edwards, the young man laying upon the mat in the center of the circle here upon the gorge. Bert, in spite of his raging fever and intense suffering, was cheerfully and eagerly anticipating another Sunday morning service. But would there be time for the service now upon the very edge of danger? The little group hesitated. Young Edward's burning eyes pleaded. Sutherland bent over to touch the young man's forehead and to speak a personal word of courage. Theirs had been a great friendship, rooted in mutual goals and mutual thirsting after the depths or the deep truths of God. Sandy had watched Bert Edwards' first step into the river of life, where he had stood only ankle deep in its shallows. Bert had returned to Brooks Point with his Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Illinois and his major in agriculture. He had a great interest also in radio and electronics, but young Edwards was less interested in church than ever, having spent 4 years in America, attending services every Sunday, but never once being approached in a manner that would lead him to feel any personal need of Christ in his own life. Hence the Scottish missionary felt compelled to challenge Bert with the thought, though you have been a member of the church and have faithfully attended religious services and would like to practice the Sermon on the Mount, yet you must not think, A, that you are a Christian now. This is a matter, is a matter of decrees and dogmas, or merely doing this or that. No, I tell you, Albert, that to be a Christian is a matter of receiving Christ himself, or having his own life within you, a believing so that by faith Christ dwells in your heart. For the first time, Bert had felt troubled, because his minister's words had taken hold of his thoughts. 4 months later, in a quick talk with Sutherland in the living room of his home, Bert entered into a new life that was pointed out to him from the 3rd chapter of the Gospel of John. And they quote that, "Now when you receive this life, think of it as a beginning. Verily, it is a new birth, as Jesus pictures it here in this chapter. But there are many things that follow. Here you are in waters to the ankles, so to speak. But turn the page and you will see the mountain of well springing up in worship and communion with God every day. It is a real and living wonderful experience. And there is yet more. Look at this passage in John 7 where it speaks of rivers and water flowing out in service and in practical usefulness to God. Here are waters to the waist, and so the Christian life is a matter of growing in grace, you know, until you come out in the waters to swim in. All the deeper things that you don't understand now, things that seem so difficult and such mysteries to you, as you believe to see and follow on to know, you will come out into rivers where you may enjoy the wonders of God's truth. Now as Sutherland looked at Bert Edwards lying on the ground in exile, dying, he marveled at all the adversity and the trial of these days had failed to drain his spiritual resources. Surely Bert was swimming now in the waters of the river, whose other shore was almost visible to him. This would be his last Sunday on earth, yet as loved ones knelt around him this morning, they were concerned to feel that even waiting for one more sermon would be too grave to risk. Already the Jap scouts were trailing them. They must go. But the scoutsmen addressed Bert cheerily and said, "We can at least sing a hymn now, Bert. What would you like us to sing?" Parched lips framed the words, "Count your blessings," and on this lookout of threatening destruction, the little group found themselves singing, "When upon life's billows you are tempest tossed, when you are discouraged, thinking all is lost, count your many blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord hath done." The song sang peace into the souls of the missionaries as they filed cautiously and quickly away, down the narrow path through the gorge to their house on the bank of a nearby stream. Often their thoughts went back to the last short, hurried service at Macagua Gorge and the song Bert Edwards requested. Other services had been held there too, previous to this one, and Sandy could hear his own words of comfort to the little group coming back to help him now and his wan family struggling for existence. We are brought to this outlook on our life at this time and to the things that have fallen out our way to see that our trust is really in God Himself. Now the promises of God's Word, they are not just wall text to hang on the bottom of a bed. Each one is something under which we can write our name and claim. You see, they are not just subjective things, but things that are truly a part of our lives. This faith isn't anything to us. It is God who is fitting us to our tests and giving us the necessary grace as the time comes. We do not get grace before the time, but only when we are passing that way. This grace was in the song of Macagua Gorge, and it was the experience of Bert Edwards also. His faith did not consider circumstances, nor look on the physical obstacles, but it looked at God Himself, the God of creation, the God of resurrection, and the God of the Psalms of Habakkuk also. So often Bert had heard his beloved pastor quote the song of the prophet, whose eyes were not his circumstances, the bare fields, the scorched trees, the empty stalls, but he had his eyes on God. Although the fig tree shall not blossom, neither shall fruit be in the vines, the labor of the olive shall fail, and the field shall yield no meat. The flock shall be cut off from the fold, and there shall be no herd in the stalls. Yet will I rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation. And that's out of the Psalm of Habakkuk. And Bert's minister would go on to say, you must ask, hasn't God said that the gold and the silver is mine, the cattle upon 1,000 hills? Well, that's true, but you know you might be where he hasn't set the gold or silver, and you might be among the 1,000 hills where he hasn't been pleased to put his cattle. And it's then that you must keep your eye upon the Lord himself. That is faith. It is to rejoice in Jehovah. I will joy in the God of my salvation. To Bert Edwards, these words were vital, and as he looked out towards the sea, his soul was lifted up to behold the glory of the God of Israel, which came from the way of the east, and the earth shined with his glory. And on the Sunday following the enemy invasion, the song of blessings, the fresh grave appeared upon the gorge, and the morning sun dared to smile upon its lowly contours. The Edwards family had fled to another camping, and the body of Bert Edwards rested in a grave overlooking his own lands, the acres of his earthly inheritance. Mr. T. H. Edwards had been left with his son's dream burning in his own soul. It was a dream that had developed out of Bert's own experiences among the mountain pagans of Palawan. For it had been Bert's job to go up into the forest in order to supervise the handling of the amagia gum after it was gathered from the tall palms by expert native acrobats who know how to throw a rattan vine from the base of one tree to the higher limbs of another, and then to climb up the rattan tighten rope fashion in order to gather the precious gum. Bert's primary interest, however, had been in the people themselves who lived in the rugged hogback mountain terrain and had been expert in climbing sheer cliffs, carrying loads of rice baskets strapped around their foreheads. They even dared to descend the face of the rock with their babies wrapped on a cloth sling and resting upon their hips. Once in a while, the baby in an impoverished hammock would be a mongrel pup, greatly beloved as a pet. Trying to understand that. So they would descend up and down the face of the rock with their babies wrapped in the sling, resting upon their hips. But it says once in a while, the baby in the impoverished hammock would be a mongrel pup, greatly beloved as a pet. So I'm not quite sure what they mean by that, but that's interesting. However, Bert never got to see most of the villages of these people. Nobody did because in order to protect themselves against epidemic diseases which could come to them from the outside world, the Palawanis practiced the custom of Tagan. It's spelled Tagon. That is, they barricaded the trails into their villages so that strangers, even other Palawanis, were kept out, and it made it even more effective. They would aim the deadly sharp bamboo arrows of their supuks, their blowguns, at persons who dared enter the trails without permission of the village Palima. Often, even in trading, there would be no contacts with the merchant. No contact with the merchants. Materials for barter, gums, beeswax, rattan, would be left at the designated place on a trail, and the trader would pick it up there, leaving his exchange of seawater salt or cloth or food, or perhaps raw currency in the form of crockery plates. Bert Edwards' dream, however, reached out to these unexplored mountain regions towards the west and the north, and his dream had also direct reference to his schooling in electronics. Dad, he he had said. Why couldn't we have recordings made and processed into permanent records bearing the gospel as Sandy Sutherland so clearly presents it? We could have hundreds of records made, and along with mechanical phonographs, we could place them out on the mountain trails where Palawanos could carry them into inaccessible villages. You know, that is some of these places where it would tax us to carry even a Bible or a toothbrush. They have actually had a Singer sewing machine carried to them because they wanted it. What what use they could make of it with their skirts and no electricity, no one could ever know. But I am sure that the only way to reach thousands of these people would be through phonographs and records. After the long night had passed, the Edwards family had returned to Brooks Point. They found that the lives of the Scottish missionary family had also been preserved. After 2 long years more of wandering in the mountains, rendering to the Allies invaluable services as enemy evaders, there was at last underneath their feet the iron decks of the United States submarine, which rescued them along with a group of American boys and brought them to Australia, where they were hospitalized for 4 months. In gratitude to God, the Sutherlands had returned to take up their labors on behalf of the tribes around the southeastern point of Palawan. They were ready again to give themselves in utmost devotion, not looking for appreciation or favor, save only from the God who had commissioned them and spared them for this task. And after a while, Harry Edwards spoke to the Scot missionaries concerning Bert's dream about putting his minister's sermons upon the records for the Palawans. But they could not be in English, you know. That is true. I had thought of that also, Edwards had replied. We must have them made in a central dialect of the Palawans. It would be very guide indeed. Uh, Yet how could this be done? Some years later, in October of 1949, Anne Sherwood and I were booked to sail on the SS McKinley, headed for the Philippines. But not until August of 1950 would we set foot upon the shores of the southwest trip of Palawan, one of the 4 or 5 larger islands of the 7,000 island um, area, and I shall never forget the thrill of looking into the eager, kindly face of Mr. Henry Edwards as we sat in a corner of a little chapel by the sea at Brooks Point, for he was saying, "This is the dream of my boy." We know he was right. Certainly, they cannot be yet reached except through records and phonographs. When I read of your work on the Sunday School Times several months ago, I felt sure that somehow you could help us, but we didn't think that you yourselves would come. I'm going to take one moment to pause. I'd like to see how long the next chapter is. I'd like to give a few minutes for thoughts and questions before we'll read one more chapter after this today. But interesting, huh, that you have a couple of things happening. You've got, the Japanese coming in to invade. You have these missionaries, the Sutherland family, the Edwards family, that have been the primary ones there exploring, kind of scouting out what is the spiritual, um, you know, the spiritual state of the different tribes there in the Philippines, who's, received the gospel, who has not. So they kind of have been on these scouting endeavors and, thinking, planning, how can we get the gospel to these people? Yes, thank you, Annette. A spiritual assessment is what they've been doing. In the midst of that, they have a further trial with the Japs coming in. They have to flee the country, and at the loss of one of their sons, yet now they've come back and they've reached out to Joy rudder off, um, hearing some of the work that she's done. But what are your thoughts, questions, things that stood out? Let's see, I see some stuff going into chat here. Annette says, oh, hold on, popped up something. Let's see, yes, they were getting a lay land spiritually and from the welfare point of view as well. TJ says, love hearing these stories, builds our faith, especially when you're going through a huge transition. Yeah, so true.
I know this is the exposition kind of point in the book, but I'm going to turn around and ask you, Jessie, what you're thinking of these first couple of chapters. What about this setting, this setup that you think is remarkable?
Yeah, for me, there's a couple things that really kind of hit home. I think in any setting, no matter where you are, whether, you've been established in churches or, you've moved to a new area, um, for me, that's what it felt like a lot of times in life. All throughout my childhood, I moved pretty much every 6 months. So for me, it was a common thing where everything was always in upheaval, everything was always new people with different ideas, thoughts. Yet, in the midst of that, in my early years, I'd have the cover life where, some of it was new brotherhood people that, there was always that, adjusting to how do I live among these people? I can't say things about what's really happening. I can't, expose that. Yet for me, like there was always that desire to tell. I was always looking for who's not part of the system, who really is walking with God and who can I tell um, things to. And, right before I got out, we had moved to the Madison, Wisconsin area. And in there, the Lord gave us this beautiful little church with true believers. Like I had maybe had one or two people before that, I knew were true believers in the Lord, but that really was the first church um, where I knew that those people loved God. The pastor, um, his name was Pastor Gasser. He actually was a military chaplain, and he and his wife, at the time didn't have any children. It was a very small little conservative Baptist church there, and they had, a lot of, it was, I would say, primarily a lot of individuals that were 50 and older who attended that church. So we kind of were some of the only children really at that church. And those people just kind of took us in. They started, they didn't know the full extent of, what are the issues in this little family with these children that's joined us. Like they could sense there was stuff going on. I know that they knew, they could sense that there was a deep darkness, a deep struggle in our lives, but they didn't know what it was. And, they just began to love on us. And I can remember, the first time I kind of somewhat felt safe, like I could just show my love for God. I could, when they would, one of the guys, elderly guys who kind of was over the children's ministry. His name was Herb. His wife was Chloe, and she would play the piano and would sing songs and lead us in worship. And it was just such a beautiful thing to, you know, each week have an hour or two where I could like just let loose and just worship God. And that was the church where they had the library with all these missionary books. And so the Lord kind of directed me to that library. They encouraged me to read. They've, realized I liked reading, and Herb would, gently kind of point at certain books and would be like, "Oh, I think you might like that one." And I still have, I'll maybe show it next week. I have he gave me a book for Christmas that I still have. Um, that was this little story about this girl. It's kind of like a Heidi story, but a Christian one. But it's about this little girl who has to go live up in the Alp Mountains. But I can remember them trying to minister to me. And, so a lot of this kind of reminds me, like when I hear of Edwards and Sutherland, their hearts kind of remind me of, Urban, this in Pastor Gasser and Chloe, and those who first began to, there was a pre-work before the Lord delivered me out of the system. The work had already begun to teach me how to live in Christ. And these people were part of those first people who were, recognizing the gifts in me and were starting to minister to that. So that's kind of what this reminds me of.
I was going to say that when I got this announcement of this book, I found it interesting that it was for the Philippines primarily, because when I served mission, it was for Taiwan, which is awfully close. And
Yeah.
the lay of the land is very much similar in that it is this area where it's primarily mountainous,
Hmm.
and you have the native Shandiren who are the mountain people versus those who are Chinese. And part of when you're sent, like you had an experience of, being in a place for a short period of time, say 6 months was your example. Mine was 4 months in each area. And, it's not under my control, but the first thing is the assessment. What's
Hmm.
the spiritual and the welfare assessment of the area? Who are the seekers who really want to get out of, their worship of Madzu or any other things, and who are interested in coming to Jesus Christ? So I guess I recognize that. I'm adding to that.
Yeah. Thank you. That's good. And there are further books they kind of crossed with another missionary couple, John and Isabel Kahn, who were more centralized there in China, Thailand, Taiwan, all those areas. So it'd be interesting because those books are really good too. So maybe we'll put those on our list here as well. But Linda, what's your question there?
All right,
Or
I'll warn you. I'm working in the garden, so I'm just going to put it on video so you guys can see me anyway. Not a conversation. I felt like when I asked God, what is it He wants me to hear? As you were telling that story, I felt like He was saying, I've given you your mission field. You need to do the hard work, like lean in, do the hard work, and let me lead you. And so I feel like I'm just getting encouragement from the Holy Spirit to be obedient in what He's put before
good,
me and to do His
good.
work and to be an outreach and evangelize. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's it. But
It's
thank you. I
interesting
appreciate it.
because especially if we look at how our society is today, you have such a huge focus on surety of income, where people want that secure, they want to know what they're going to have coming in. They feel like to get that, they have to have that 9 to 5, 40 hours a week job. That's kind of what they put all their security in. And yet in here, there's some concepts introduced that really the church has lost this. Like, they'll teach, oh, if you tithe, God will provide. Usually that's through your job. But she literally says in there that God was the one keeping the accounts. Like he was the one giving the distribution of all the needs that, they would simply pray. They didn't ask anybody. They didn't, say, hey, we need this much. We need this provision. They just simply would go to the Lord in prayer and say, here's what we need. And the Lord would provide. It's a huge mindset shift that we see taking place in this book. And every need was provided, and they would rejoice, both in the knowing that God was going to provide, but also when the provision came, that they had everything. So, yeah, good feedback. All right, let's
you.
read one last chapter here. Chapter 3, Stateside Mountains. And she quotes Oswald Chambers from Not Knowing Whither. It says, we have nothing to do with what will happen if we obey. We have to abandon to God's call in unconditional surrender and smilingly wash our hands of the consequences. As our boat had sailed out of the Golden Gate Harbor, slowly compelling Anne Sherwood and me to turn our eyes toward the unending west, we felt a deep sense of steadying and rest begin to encircle us. It was a sense of being anchored in the one who had commanded us to go, and whose resources were measureless, like the wideness of the sea and sky, which presently unfolded our small freighter into the semblance of eternity. Joy Rudderoff, why were you going? It was simply this. In the Philippines, there are many tribes who have nothing of the gospel in their own languages, and the time of opportunity for reaching them is short. If we who have the facilities for putting the message into recordings directly from native lips, if we do not go, then how shall they hear? There had to be no decision to make except to acknowledge that which was our obvious responsibility. The reason that we could go out rejoicing, singing, was the assurance that we were in God's vigilant care and love, in setting about to do the thing most precious to him, the reaching of unreached souls. We could not fail. Now I stood flat against the firm pole of the ship's mast, feeling the force of the night wind as it swept across the third deck and passed me against the ship. The salt spray from its breath was cleansing, invigorating. It was good to feel oneself pushed up against security, and I felt that the recent pressures of tested faith were like winds pushing us flat upon God alone. This brought a fresh realization of dependence upon him and a new abandonment of heart and will to his purposes and plans. 10 days had rolled beneath our ship, and Anne and I would not see land for yet another 7 days. Since leaving San Francisco October 29th, the 6 watches of every day had slowly passed, with each small measure of time marked off by the ship's going, which sounded every half hour of the day or night. And there was the constant throb of the ship's engine, and the loud roar of the wind through the portholes, and the continual splash of waves against the prow of the boat. A length of the 6,000 ocean miles was stretching out between us and the United States. On the SS President McKinley, this is quoted from her letters, our boat is a seahorse that raises its head and shakes its mane or its tail instead. The paws at the waters beneath his feet, like a thoroughbred racer that's never been beat. The wind and the rain may lash at the side, but with quivering flank and undaunted pride, He lunges through the angry brine, careless for mountain or steep decline. Onward we ride to the west to the sun, on till the tortuous journey is done. The foaming in the heavy has come to an end, and our sturdy ship, like a staunch old friend, sails safely into a quiet sea. The docks docks and says goodbye to me, careless for mountain or steep decline. And I stood watching the starlit crests bending and breaking over obsidian slopes, building up out of the black troughs. It was a thrill to watch our ship plow through them, rolling back in the waves, splitting them in two at the crest and sending them roaring off in other directions. And I thought of the great swells that had already run under our ship, breaking upon the bow and lower decks to move on in swift unhurried majesty, reminding me of the figurative mountains we had left behind us thus far on our way to the Philippines. These had been the mountains on the United States side of the tropical island. I remembered the cross and continent series of financial emergencies which we had experienced through our recording trip from New York to Los Angeles. It had been a story of small change and million-dollar lessons to equip us for the larger emergencies on foreign soil. We could have captioned the whole chain of desert hills in winter of 1949 as a picture of small amounts of frequent intervals as needed. In every case, they skipped out of our way like little lambs, but always in very unexpected directions. Never did our pocketbook emergencies reveal themselves to anyone about us, and as usual, this trip had been financially independent of the work at headquarters. But how heartening it had to be to see the hills run away like lambs, making way for us to safely reach home with a treasure of 20 languages. Many of these were for Africa, India, Europe, and South American Indians, as well as others such as the Winnebago, the Seneca, the Omaha, for tribes in the United States. Then there was the day to get our passports. No money in the morning, but by afternoon, when we needed to go for them, each of us had the necessary $9. The 2 months later, when visas had to be paid, $20 was supplied just in time. But what about tickets that seemed like a fortune? $485 apiece. But when the time came for down payment, there it was again. The nick of time supply, yet the whole ticket must be paid soon. It was in Seattle at this time and in the home of Miss Mabel Gwynn. A letter came from Los Angeles saying, Miss S. has told us that she desires to pay the passage to the Philippines for both you and Anne. The money was actually in hand just a few days before our sailing, but we would never exchange the rare lessons learned during these rich and glorious days of proving God down where our barrel of meal had no false bottom and only 1 or 2 kernels of grain. Psalm 114, 3-6. The sea saw it and fled. The Jordan was driven back. The mountains skipped like lambs, and the little hills like lambs. What ailed thee, O thou sea, that thou fleddest? Thou Jordan, that you were driven back? You mountains, that you skipped like rams, and you little hills like lambs. But there we had been formidable obstacles facing us still. Before we should ever find ourselves aboard ship for the island Orient, and now I thought of the last fearful peak that had risen suddenly with a flood, threatening to crash overhead and leave our entire work broken and adrift. I felt the stormy sea the night, the howling wind, to be a comfort to me, because they so perfectly matched the experiences of the weeks before. Our leaving as I relived them now in memory. This storm had come without warning, however. 3 months before the date of our sailing to the Philippines, there had been one more opportunity for recording in the States. And this trip had taken us into the Pacific Northwest, across Indian reservations, and into Saskatchewan, Canada, netting the thrilling capture of the 34 languages, one of them Tibetan. Santa Barlow had gone with me this time as an apprentice in field recording, which was to carry on in my absence during 7 months of the time that Anne and I would be working in the Philippines. And it was on this trip that we were to discover the Malay Polynesian anthropologist Harold Conklin, whose advice and help was to prove invaluable for the Philippine language hunt. At home, Eleanor Collinley had was doing a magnificent piece of work for Anne and me in handling all the details concerning our trip to the island, and her informative notebook and know-how regarding all the arrangements for tickets, passports, shots, and necessary correspondence had freed me for our 3 months in the North, and it had freed Anne also for her studio work in supervising the completion of records made in the East. We had left a happy compound on the hill of Whitmer Street and felt especially gratified in the knowledge that our own Eastern representative, Marion Bracken, would be spending a few months with them. Yet it had been difficult to leave the hill for our Northwest language hunt, since I knew that within 2 or 3 weeks of my return, Anne and I would have to leave again for the Philippines. Then the day came when we were home again, plunging into the last-minute preparations to leave, not anticipating the sudden mountainous tidal wave that was to lay us all low before God. It was with shocking suddenness that I realized the work of an enemy among us. An oppressing atmosphere of criticism had suddenly developed among our little well-beloved group of workers, and I saw no human causes for it, nor did any of them. But it was just in time that we recognized in this steep wall shadowing us and threatening our work as perhaps nothing else could, the same blockade maneuvers that we had felt in the presence of other stateside mountains. There had been nothing to do but look up and push on. The Book of Refuge plainly said to us, God is not a man that he should lie, neither the Son of Man that he should repent. Hath he said, and shall he not do it? Or has he spoken, and shall he not make good? Numbers 23:19. On the eve of our day of prayer, Wednesday the 19th, several of us knelt together in pleading prayer for deliverance from the threats of the enemy. The next day, our staff met together, eager as always to be right, each one desiring not to be the hindrance in some way. Matthews 5:23 through 24 and 1 Samuel 15:22. If thy brother hath aught or has something against thee, leave thy gift and first be reconciled to thy brother. To obey is better than to sacrifice, to hearken than to the fat of rams. We took the open Bible and spread it out. Here was a rock upon which we could fall and be broken, only to be molded into a new and better vessel. Our staff were one vessel, and there must be filled for the thirst of tribes who were helpless and find drink should this one fail. We confessed our faults and sins to one another and to God. Openly and frankly we said, I have thought this about you. I have been jealous. I have misjudged you. I have been a hindrance. I have criticized. Tears mingled and tension broke. The winds of God swept throughout our threshold that was home, and the day of prayer closed with deep peace abiding upon us. We knew now that there was nothing to hinder God's blessing to us on behalf of others. Up to this time there had been a stoppage of blessing. Current bills were overdue, and financial stress was such that I had turned over to the Treasury all monies designated to us for the Philippine trip. But Thursday the mail began again to be rich with unsolicited gifts, and the money came in so steadily in the last days before we left that I could feel free to use a part of that which I had so recently relinquished to the work. Like the sweet smell of the new-mown summer grass after a shower, a fragrance of Christ had filled the hilltop compound at Winter Street. There had been a sudden lifting up out of the trough of the valley until it seemed in an instant the sheer bluff was sculled and a song was begun in unison upon its solid crest. It had been the most dreadful mountain in our decade of history at Gospel recordings. We had seen it breaking forth into singing. We knew ourselves to be, even because of it, on the higher plane of harmonious living when we had ever experienced before. Isaiah 58, 9 through 10. Then shalt thou call, and the Lord shall answer thee. You shall cry, and he shall say, Here I am. If you take away from the midst of you the yoke, and putting forth the finger and speaking vanity, and if you draw out your soul to the hungry and satisfy the afflicted in soul, then shall thy light rise in obscurity, and thy darkness shall be as noonday. The day eventually came when Anne and I climbed the narrow gangplank of the deck of our ship, leaving behind us that secure stateside plateau that meant home and beloved fellow workers. We took a last look at Virginia Miller and Elsie Zimmerman standing on Pier 56. It was harder to say goodbye this time than at any other time before. Our gangplank seemed to be a slender bridge whose other end lost itself over the edge of the sea, fading into the sky in the midst, which yet veiled the awesome peaks that were before us in the Philippines. It will take you 100 years, young Conklin had said, but I would love to go right out there too and help you. At times it did seem ludicrous, even to us, to think of two women attempting to technically problematic task to tape recordings among the pagan tribes in the mountains of the 7,000 islands. Day by day, we watched the boat cutting a path of foam on and on, now already in tropical waters. Soon we would all be on our way to Manila. As the time drew near, a chat of the pursuer on the McKinley made us realize that we might have heavy equipment taxes to pay before we could take our luggage from the wharf, and at times we let questions bombard us pell-mell. What would we do first? Where would we go? Where would we stay in Manila? Who would meet us? I could not have known it then, but at this very time a busy security at home suddenly let this same question, who will meet them, claim her attention. The picture could have been filed something like this. In her upstairs office at 124, Virginia Miller closed her books of accounts with a sigh of satisfaction. October, with all its days of testing, had ended with a perfect balancing of income and expenditures. She cleared her desk with a gesture of neat, swiftly efficiency. She started to leave the room with the day's work counted done at 9 o'clock in the evening. She glanced at the calendar, November 7, 1949. Joy and Anne, she thought, have one more week on the ocean, then Manila. And with a shock of apprehension, Virginia let her thoughts follow them to the pier. I believe I should check to see what arrangements were made for their being met. She pulled out the files recently turned in by Joy's personal secretary before she left, answering the call to go out as a missionary to Mexico, and found in them a letter that Eleanor could have considered final arrangements, but a careful reading of it showed that it was not enough. As far as I can tell, she observed, not a soul in Manila knows when they will be coming, and their boat is scheduled to dock on the 15th. With a decisive twist of the typewriter roller, she shot the thin stationery and carbon under the keys of her fingers, made them dance like a hard patter of rain upon pavement. Addressing the letter to the Far Eastern Bible School of Manila, she wrote, Dear Christian friends, this is to let you know the director of Gospel Record Recordings Incorporated, Joy Ritteroff, and her companion, Miss Anne Sherwood, are due to arrive in Manila approximately November 15th and are giving your address as their forwarding address. So will you please hold their mail until they call for it? The letter continued with a paragraph explaining that the purpose of their visit to the Philippines was to be that the recording of some of the more of the 100 languages and dialects of the islands. And then she added, we do not expect any missionary or missionary organization to assume any financial responsibility with regard to these recordings. But you realize that, of course, that cooperation with missionaries in getting the people who can best record is absolutely necessary. Anything you may be able to do in getting Miss Rudderoff and Miss Sherwood orientated and in contact with those who can help them reach the natives best qualified to make recordings will be very much appreciated. In a matter of a few minutes, the letter was finished, zipped off the typewriter, slipped into an envelope, sealed and stamped with 25 cents airmail. She snapped off the light to her office, hurried down the steps and outside and up the hill to Loma Drive to the nearest mailbox. As she mailed the letter, she noted that it would be picked up by 10 o'clock. Would it reach Manila before the boat docked? We first sighted land 3 days out of Manila Bay. It was the cone of a spurting volcano rising out of the sea, and on the next day the green contours of the little island appeared far away on the water. Our ship, because of some engine trouble, had refused the regular course around the north of Luzon and was coming in at the south of it, weaving between smaller islands. How exciting it was passing by green islands of mountains and coconut palms. Although it was raining, we had to run out on deck to watch the Chinese freighter pass, or a Philippine sampan, or a flotilla of sailboats. At this very time, I learned later, at the Far Eastern Bible Institute in the suburbs of Manila, the office door pushed open from the hall of Bob Bowman, walked in just as the secretary finished reading the letter from Virginia Miller of Gospel Recordings Incorporated. She looked up. Mr. Bowman, do you happen to know a Miss Joy Rudderoff of Gospel Recordings in Los Angeles? This letter says her boat is due in Manila today. It is probably docked by now. Mr. Bowman's face broke into a cordial smile. Joy Rudderoff? Well, I should say, I do know who she is. Hurriedly, he read the letter and quickly stepped across the 100 meters of his own office on the transmitter building on the grounds of DZAS. He soon had the President Line's Steamship Company of Manila on the telephone. Presently putting down the receiver, he thought, I think I will be able to make the boat. We were approaching the city through the breakwater and entering the harbor. The skyline of the city was imposing with its number of white business buildings towering somewhat into the sky. Although none were higher than 13 stories, slowly over boat drafted between the hulks of Japanese warships and slipped silently up to the dock near the bombed pier. We eagerly scanned the little clusters of brown longshoremen awaiting the boat to see if any looked familiar. We really did not know of anyone to expect, especially since the boat was so late in coming in. But before we docked, we noticed among the group standing at the wharf that a hat came off and began to wave a friendly welcome. And yes, the broad grin was for us, and it was Bob Bowman himself. Presently, we saw him talking with officials, gesticulating in such manners as we knew he was telling them about records. And when we descended the gangplank and set foot on the wharf, our baggage had been nicely cleared and marked with OK, which meant that we did not have to pay taxes on any of our large amount of luggage. But our first gratitude of finding ourselves met by so competent a person as Robert Bowman was to increase profoundly that we got our first look at war-torn Manila, the surging traffic, the masses, the ruins. What would we have done unescorted? How could we have managed at all? Our personal luggage packed in Bob's car, we drove away from the waterfront and entered the battered city. It had just rained and flooded sewage gutters along the streets. The evidences of squalor and poverty were almost overwhelming. We were seeing the suffering in the Philippines. Traffic was indescribable, for a veritable army of jeeps moved through the muddy, streaming streets, and wedged in between the jeeps were scores of little horses and buggies and multitudes of people. But when we reached the grounds of the radio station 7 miles outside Manila, it was like coming into a fat pasture and good, where the land was quiet, wide, and peaceable. Here the jungle growth had been cleared off so that the 12 acres looked like a beautiful park with mango and saddle trees shading large green lawns. It had been a matter of only a few hours since our boat had docked, and already we had been located in a situation perfectly suited to our needs. For here we were in the midst of a staff of radio technicians. The next door to this radio city were the grounds of a separate missionary organization, the Far Eastern Bible Institute and Seminary, known as FEBIAS. Isaiah 55:12, you shall go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills shall break forth before you in singing. And we're gonna, let me see, they've got one more little insert here. It says Luzon. Luzon is the largest of the Philippine Islands with an area of nearly 41,000 square miles. Since the capital is situated in one of its fine harbors, Manila is the great center for commerce and national affairs. The lowlands, which extend the full length of the western course in Cagayan River Valley, have been largely Christianized, but the inaccessible regions have remained pagan. The mountain tribes vary somewhat in origin. The Iroquois are divided into two groups. One is Innu, the short Mongol type mixed with tall Mongol. The other is short Mongol with some Innu and Negrito, a certain amount of Malay blend. The Apaeos are predominantly Indonesian, while the Kalingas are almost purely a tall Mongol type. The origins of the leylanders are varied as those of the mountain tribes, with Malayan, Papuan, and Malaysian elements. These people have a thirst for education that is almost unparalleled, and in large numbers they are leaving their former occupations for the professions. Gathered with H. Oatley Byer's Population of the Philippine Islands in 1916. And she lays out some of the languages recorded in Luzon. They have Addison, Bontoc, there were 6 dialects, Imbangog, Ifunga, 5, Ilocano, there were 2, Isnang, Itawas, there were 2, Itbayat, Ivitan, Kalinga, there were 10, Kinkinkale, Ignorant, Nambaloy, there were 2, Negrito of Palanan, Talanlang, this one's kind of hard to say, Tinginian, there were 4, Yogad and Visayan, there were Silabano and Ilongo as well. So those are some of the formalized languages that all came out of that Luzon area where they were. A lot. Wow. All right. Well, final thoughts,
Sure.
comments.
I just, one of the things for me was going back that sort of caught my attention, and I always have to smile at that. The part where we're talking, where they're getting ready to go and everything, it's exciting, and then the little element of criticism and all these little negative Nancy's start coming in. And I have to smile at that because isn't that so typical, right? That the minute we something really, we do something that really makes us happy or gives us joy, or it's an exciting time and there's a group of us, and then suddenly, so often it happens that something starts happening to try and sabotage, right? The whatever it might be. I think that's, to me, that just highlights the human experience, and that when these things happen, we have to know we're just being challenged on our weaknesses, and it's just an opportunity to turn them into strengths. That's all. I find that so interesting when, when we
Yeah,
do these things, and then something like that sneaks in all the time, trying to
exactly. And it
stop
was
you.
interesting how she correlates that little bit of criticism that slipped in began to impact the flow
Exactly.
of the finances, the provision coming in. But how did they correct that? They began to confess to each other, forgive me for
Exactly.
these thoughts that I've had about you. And they began to name, say the thoughts that they had. And then there was a restoration in the financial provision after that. So
It's
that's
amazing how
interesting.
that works, right? That's why I say when we look at these things, it's always an opportunity to turn them into strengths,
Hmm.
rather than see it as something that is there to um, debilitate us, right?
Yeah,
It's always up to us to turn it into something that can work. Yeah.
exactly. That was good to bring out.
It was
All
great.
right.
I'm enjoying it. I think it's an
Yeah,
exciting
it's a
journey
good
these
one. It's
ladies are
really,
embarking on.
yeah, it's really interesting and so encouraging, for the faith. So,
Yeah,
all right.
exactly.
Well, let's end with a prayer today. Heavenly Father, we just thank you for this time together. We thank you that you always encourage us. We thank you that even as we come and, we're just reading this book in the book club, Lord, that you're speaking to our hearts. You're showing us things in our own lives um, that are impacted, even from this woman's faith from years and years ago. We thank you for that. And we just give to you, Lord. We give to you and surrender to you those things that we try to hold on to that are false accounts or false records, the criticisms in our lives, the criticisms that we're holding against others. Lord, we ask your forgiveness for those things. We ask that you would help us to be those that see the miracles that you are doing, that see every day the preparatory work, the things that you are always preparing so that every good work that you call us to can be completed. Help us to live that way, Lord, rejoicing as you're preparing instead of being focused on all the mountains, all the problems. Let us see the things that are being done and let us rejoice in those things. We ask this in your powerful name, Jesus. Amen.
Amen, and thank you,
Thank you all.
Jess.
Yeah, thank you.
It was great enjoying this, and I hope you are as well, all of you who have joined us. Is there anyone that would maybe just like to leave a final comment or ask Jessie a final question before we call it a day or a month? We're calling it a month. Yeah, we're good? Okay. Well, Jessie, thank you so much. Look forward to seeing
Okay.
you in a month's time again. And guys, we'll see Jessie for a double trouble on Wednesday.
Yay.
Okay, guys, God bless. Have a beautiful week. And I hope you're all enjoying the weather, because you've stolen my sun and I'm sitting in
We'll send it
Antarctica in
back.
Africa.
We'll come bring it back.
It feels like I'm in Antarctica here. Okay, bye. Bye, guys.